we're in the Gospel in Color kind of last week of Jesus' life. And last week we talked about the triumphal entry of Jesus into Jerusalem, which actually this week is Palm Sunday, which is the Sunday that we celebrate this time where Jesus comes riding in on a donkey into Jerusalem. They are waving palm branches. People are shouting Hosanna. And it's, as we talked about last week, actually like a counter parade to the power and empire parade that Pontius Pilate would have been leading, coming into the west side of the city on his war horse with soldiers around him and the banners, and showing force and power, coming into Jerusalem to show the Jews that, hey, we are still in power. We know that this week, that in that the week that Jesus is coming into Jerusalem is Passover, and so it's a celebration for the Jewish people of them being freed from slavery, from being ruled by another ruling group. So to the Romans, they allow this to happen. We talked about last week because the Pax Romana, which is the Roman kind of way of leading, was we'll allow you to keep doing this, but we're going to show power and force to keep the peace. And so this is all happening in this week. Jesus comes riding in. He is showing a different way to be a human and to lead in humility and in love. And in Mark 11, we see, it says this: many people spread their cloaks on the road, while others spread branches they had cut in the fields. Those who went ahead and those who followed shouted, Hosanna! Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Blessed is the coming kingdom of our father David. Hosanna in the highest heaven. Now, these are not just statements. These are actually, this is a week where the Jewish people are celebrating freedom. And so they believe Jesus is coming in to free them. And the Romans know this is happening, so the Romans are showing force to say, if you try anything, we'll kill you, basically. We will overpower you. And you see these two colliding kingdoms. And so, like I said, we talked about it a lot last week. But we're going to go into the next part of what happens when Jesus enters Jerusalem. So Jesus comes into Jerusalem. He rides in on the donkey. These people are shouting Hosanna. They're following him into the city. And Jesus goes straight to the temple. Now, we know, and we'll talk about today, there's a time where Jesus goes into the temple and he flips tables. But when Jesus enters Jerusalem and is leading this procession, he goes to the temple, and in Mark 11, verse 11, it says this: Jesus entered Jerusalem and went into the temple courts. He looked around at everything, but since it was already late, he went out to Bethany with the 12. So he went outside the city to stay. So Jesus comes into Jerusalem, goes to the temple, and observes, looks around, sees what's happening, and then he leaves. There's no speech, there's no confrontation, no miracle, no flipping of tables. He's just observing what is happening. And it's one of those moments, I think, in the story that feels kind of easy to skip over, maybe. Like, okay, he just went to the temple and he left. But it might be one of the most important moments in this entire story of the last week of Jesus. Because what happened later, when we see Jesus come back to the temple, is that we realize that this was not a reaction of anger. That Jesus is actually, this is a response to what he observed and what he saw and what he knew was happening. It's thought through. To understand what Jesus saw, I think we have to look at kind of the system and what was happening there. We have to understand where Jesus was standing when he came and he observed. Because this wasn't just a building. When we talk about the temple of Jerusalem, Has anybody been there? Has anybody been to Jerusalem? One? Yeah, one person. Go, two, three. Oh, anybody else? Like, sometimes I think we think like he walked into the church, right? This building. No, this is not just church or a building. This is an entire system. This thing is humongous. He walked into the temple in the first century. And what he walked into is layers. The temple is built in these layers. And this is the second temple. This was built. In fact, do we have a picture? I think it'll work. This is the temple space. I forget, it's something like 6 football fields. Like, it is humongous. And there are barriers, there are walls, there's different sections. In fact, this big area here is called the court of the Gentiles. So it's the court of the non-Jews. Anybody could go into the court of the Gentiles. And then you start entering in. Go to the next picture. Actually, go back real quick. So this part of the temple, the main part right here, we're going to look at in this next diagram. So you have the court of the Gentiles, where everyone's allowed. And then we'll go to the middle here, the main part of the temple. And now there's places where certain people can go and be. The court of women. So Jewish women could enter into this court, but they could go no further than that. There's this court of Israel right here. This is actually Jewish men. So Jewish men could enter into that portion of the temple. Then you go into the court of priest, the altar. This is where sacrifices are done. So priests can go into this part of the temple. And then you have the holy place and the most holy place, the Holy of Holies. The Holy of Holies is the place where the high priest, the leader of the priest, could enter into one time a year to make a sacrifice. So it's the place where they believed this is where the Spirit of God is. It's where he enters in and he's able to, the high priest is the mouthpiece of the Jewish people to God. This is the go-between. But you can see the layers that are here, that are built into this temple. And this is biblical. It was made this way. But the outer court was for everyone. Then there's barriers. There's like literal walls and places that you cannot cross. In fact, throughout history, as they've uncovered some of these, they've actually found on parts of the walls and the columns, there were things carved that said, like, Gentiles past this point, basically you're going to die. Like, death is yours now. You cannot enter this place. If you are not Jewish, you cannot come into this area. There was a reason that the Gentiles were allowed. This actually happened back in Isaiah, where the prophet Isaiah talked about that this will be a house for all nations. It was this opening of the temple to all nations, not just the Jews. So this is a very important place. Go back to the other picture. Did I lose him? Oh, he said, wait. Sorry, Daniel. Important place. It's huge. A space where people were supposed to come and be able to see what is happening with God and get as close to God as they were allowed to. But this architecture taught people something about God. Who was close, who God was for, who belonged, and who didn't. And then, outside of just the temple space, there was the system itself. If you came to worship, especially during the Passover time, now I think I mentioned last week, this city, there was about 40 or 50,000 people that lived here. During Passover would swell to 200, 300,000 people. Some historians have said even up to 1 million people would enter into Jerusalem during this time. So Jews are making a pilgrimage to Jerusalem for this event. So people would travel from a long way. And if you came into worship, then you needed a sacrifice, because under the Jewish law, you would sacrifice an animal for your sins. The priest would sacrifice it. The blood would cover your sins so that you could be forgiven. So you had to do the sacrifice. So when you came, you needed an animal for a sacrifice, and you needed to buy the animal there, because a lot of people traveling from you can't bring an animal with you. It was really hard to maybe bring the animal with you to keep it safe in order to present an unblemished animal for the sacrifice. So what people would do is they would come to the temple, and then they were able to purchase an animal for sacrifice. So this was part of the system. It was supposed to be there. It was built in. Then there was another part of it where when you would come in, you could not use just like Roman coins in the temple. There was temple coins. They were shekels that were thought to be the purest form of currency at the time. And you only use temple currency in the temple. Also a normal thing. This was part of the system. So you would come in, you would give your Roman money, and you would exchange it. Just like if you're going overseas somewhere and you take your American dollar and you exchange it for whatever money is being used in the country you're going to. Does that make sense? So they would exchange their money in order to then take their temple currency and pay for their sacrifice, or for the animal to sacrifice, or pay for the temple tax. So every Jewish man in Exodus was required to pay a temple tax. It was kind of like their tithe. For a while, it was like one time. You paid this one time and you're good. Then it became a yearly thing where you had to come pay your taxes yearly to the temple. And so you would have to pay that in the temple coin. So you'd have to exchange your money for that. So again, this is part of the system. It's built in. None of it on its own was a problem. And I think sometimes we miss that point when we see what is happening with Jesus. And when he comes into the temple, all this was part of the system. But what we're going to see is, like so many systems, this system did not stay clean. And so we're going to see how it became corrupted. The temple was this system, not just a place to come worship, but some scholars like Gerald West, I believe Gerald West was a liberation theologist. He uses the phrase, the city, temple, state system. So the temple is like the city center. It is a whole system. Like, he used it to phrase it like there was, a lot of us would think like there was religion over here, there was government over here, there was money and power over here. And the idea was Jesus just kind of stepped into the religious lane and had a problem with how people were behaving in church, maybe. And that's why he got mad. But the more you study this, the more you'll realize that that's not the world that Jesus was walking into. There wasn't a clean line between those things. The temple wasn't just a place you went to pray. It's where your money was exchanged. It's where sacrifices were approved. Now this gets interesting, because if you did bring an animal to the temple that you were going to sacrifice, you had to take that temple, or that temple, you had to take that animal to the priest or the religious leaders. They had to approve of your animal for sacrifice. Who do you think made money off of the sale of the animals in the temple? The religious leaders. Hey, I brought this one. Is this good? Oh, no, you're going to have to buy one of ours. Your sacrifice had to be approved. Your status in society was reinforced by the layers that you were allowed to enter. In fact, even the type of sacrifice that you could afford told you where you sat. in the class structure. And then where you had access to God was regulated. It was all intertwined. The people running it weren't just spiritual leaders. They were, at this point in Jesus' life, they were connected to political power. They were maintaining order for Rome, the oppressor. They were benefiting from the system, staying exactly the way that it was. In fact, if you look through archaeology and the studies of this region during that time, priest, if you go all the way go into the Old Testament, when the priest line was found, was like called by God, priests actually didn't make money. The money that would be given to the church or to the temple would help them kind of live. The food that was given would help them live. So this is what it was. It wasn't a job to make money. But when you start looking at history and the archaeology, the priests of the time of Jesus lived in some of the biggest homes, most elaborate places there were. Something had changed. I said that theologian Gerald West, he called it the city-temple state system. It was not just a building, it was a machine. It was a system where religion gave it meaning, economics and money gave it fuel, and then politics gave it its power. It was this unhealthy marriage. And everything worked together to keep things running. And for the people at the top, it worked really, really well. For the people at the bottom, it cost them everything. And once you see this, you can't really unsee it. You begin to see the pieces, even through Scripture, tie in together. Because now, when you see Jesus walk into the temple, he's not just stepping into a place of worship. He's stepping into a system that wasn't just about worship. It was religion tied to economy, to power. And Jesus walks in the night that he gets to Jerusalem. He looks around and he leaves. This doesn't sound like anything we understand at all, but it happened back in that day. So the next morning, after Jesus has come, he's seen the temple, he's seen what's happening, he leaves, they go outside of town, they stay. They're coming back into town. Jesus and his disciples are heading back. And we see in Mark 11 this story. Mark 11:12, it says, "The next day as they were leaving Bethany, Jesus was hungry. Seeing in the distance a fig tree in leaf, like it had leaves, it was growing, he went to find out if it had any fruit. When he reached it, he found nothing but leaves, because it was not the season for figs. Then he said to the tree, 'May no one ever eat fruit from you again.' And his disciples heard him say it. And then they continued on. He cursed the fig tree." Now this seems like a really weird story. Like, Jesus is hungry, goes to a tree, it's supposed to have figs, it doesn't. He's like, nobody ever, if I can't eat here, nobody can, right? But what happened was he saw this fig tree in full bloom with its leaves. He walks up to it expecting fruit, but there's nothing there. And he says, "May no one ever eat fruit from you again." And again, it feels like a strange story here until you realize that this is actually a mirror. In Hebrew scripture, the fig tree often symbolized Israel. And not just Israel, but Israel's spiritual health. So what Jesus is seeing is something that looks alive, but producing nothing life-giving. It's leaves without fruit. And Mark does something intentional. He puts this story in the middle of this week, right before Jesus enters the temple. Because the tree is telling you, this is how you read the temple. It looks great. Looks like it's doing all the things it's supposed to be doing. But there's no life-giving fruit from it. So he leaves this fig tree that he yells at. And Jesus walks back into Jerusalem, and he walks straight back into the temple. But this time, he doesn't just look around. Mark 11:15 says, on reaching Jerusalem, Jesus entered the temple courts, and he began driving out those who were buying and selling there. He overturned the tables of the money changers and the benches of those selling doves, and would not allow anyone to carry merchandise through the temple courts. Each gospel kind of has different aspects of it. John, in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they put this right before Jesus goes to the cross. In John actually starts John. I think it's in like John 2. He starts John, his book with this story. Some historians believe that Jesus may have cleansed the temple twice. Others believe that John was placing this to show his authority at the beginning of his gospel. Either way, we see this a lot. In John's gospel is the one where he wraps cords and he has a whip that he goes in and drives out the animals and the sellers. But in Mark's gospel, he goes in, he overturns the tables of the money changers and the benches of those selling doves. And then he says something that reaches way back into centuries for the Jewish people. Verse 17 says, and as he taught them, he said, it is not written, my house will be called a house. Is it not written, my house will be called a house of prayer for all nations? This is a callback to Isaiah. The prophet Isaiah had said this. This is when, like I said, the court of the Gentiles, this was this idea that, hey, this is not just going to be a temple for you, the Jewish people, but this is going to be for all nations. The inclusion of all nations was part of the prophecy. Jesus says, my house will be called a house of prayer for all nations, but you have made it a den of robbers. This phrasing, den of robbers, is also a callback to Old Testament prophecy. In Jeremiah 7, Jeremiah actually stood outside the temple. God told him, what is happening in here is corrupt. They are taking advantage of people. Go call them out and tell them that I said so. Jeremiah goes to the temple. He stands on the temple steps, and he prophesies. God knows what you're doing, and it is not okay. Fast forward to Jesus in the temple. This is supposed to be a place of all nations. You've turned it into a den of robbers. And not a single religious leader in that room or in that court would have not understood what he just said. The interesting thing is, these are indictments on what is happening in the temple. He's calling back to the prophets. Isaiah 56, it's inclusion. It is a vision where outsiders are welcome in. Jeremiah 7, it's about corruption. A system that uses religion as cover while exploiting people. And he uses the phrase a den of robbers. Anybody have a den in their house? Anybody grew up with I grew up with a den. It's like that room that, like, what do you do in there? There's like some chairs. We never went in there because there was no TV. Like, the video game system was in the other room. The den is like this cozy place. In this, it's actually like a den, like a cave. But it was a place of safety. So Jesus says, you have made this a cozy, safe place for thieves. When Jesus brings these two ideas together, he says the place was meant to be open, but it has become exclusive. This place was meant to give life, but it is taking it. And let's name kind of something that actually goes after all this, because this isn't random anger. Jesus isn't just like upset. He's not just mad about even just people selling things inside of the church. This is deep. He goes into the court of the Gentiles, that big space. As I said, you could sell things. That was part of the system. But the bazaar, the place to sell the animals and to exchange money, was supposed to be in an area either outside of the temple or right inside the little walkway area. They had moved it into the court of the Gentiles. History shows us that they had actually taken over and started to enclose the court of the Gentiles. So if you're a Gentile, where do you go? If you are not Jewish, where do you go? You are being told that you don't belong here. It had become overtaken. It was crowded. They had encroached on the space of being inclusive for all people. It's where the merchants had moved into, telling the outsiders that they were no longer welcome. And then he goes after the people selling doves, which is an interesting one. But when you look at what the dove in the temple system represented, the dove was the least expensive animal that you could purchase for sacrifice. This was the sacrificial animal for the poor. So when you came into the space, if you did not have the money to buy a lamb or something greater for your sacrifice, you would buy a dove. And evidence suggests throughout history that at this point, the religious leaders had begun to charge upwards of 15 to 20 times the normal price of a dove, taking advantage of the poorest of their society. This was an attack on those that lived on the margins. The most vulnerable in their society were paying the highest cost. And Jesus comes in and says, this is not okay. You've turned my Father's house of prayer for all nations into a den of robbers. This whole thing is about exploitation. It's using God's name in vain. It is taking advantage of people. And Jesus refuses to let it stand. This is why when he enters the temple, he flips tables. I do this sometimes because I'm a glutton for punishment, but I'll go on YouTube and watch other pastors preach about this passage. I've got some of my favorites, but it's always interesting. Like, I watched one where he's like, this is my favorite Jesus. Goes in, he's flipping tables, showing his power. I'm like, you're missing the point. I wish this was your favorite Jesus. Because he's there to protect. Not just make a point, not just to show that he's angry, not just to say, the church is my dad's house. No. He's saying, this belongs to all of us. And you have turned it into something where you are taking advantage of people, and I'm not okay with that. Now, this gets really interesting, and maybe some of you guys know this. The question is, how did the temple get to this point? It wasn't always like this. It was not always a place that just took advantage of people. The temple was part of the Jews' relationship with God. Systems don't become corrupt overnight, though, right? It kind of permeates and works its way in. So go back to the beginning briefly. The priesthood in Israel, if you go to Exodus, the tribe of Levi, the Levites are the ones that are commissioned with the charge to serve the people of Israel, to mediate, to represent the people before God. The Levites were going to be the priestly line. It was a sacred role. And it was supposed to be a lifelong appointment. The first high priest was actually Aaron, who was the brother of Moses. God told Moses, get your brother, bring him in. He's going to be the one that is my go-between. He will be the one that I speak with for the people of Israel. He will be the high priest. And from that point, it became a family calling chosen by God. You inherited basically your high priestly role. And it was good through that family line. God had chosen it, and it would just pass down, and it was lifelong. So when Aaron died, his one of his sons would be the high priest, and it would just keep going, right? But by the time of Jesus, something had shifted in the priestly line, especially the position of high priest. If you look at, there's a historian, Josephus, from the 1st century. He tells us that by this time, rulers, like the Roman rulers, were now appointing and removing high priests. This is where names start to matter in this story. They're not just names, they're people, they're characters in the life of Jesus. They're people. In the year 6 AD, a man named Annas became high priest. When he became the high priest, he was appointed by the Roman authority, Quirinius. He was the Roman governor of like Syria now, but he was a Roman authority who appointed Annas to become the high priest. It was the first time that it was pulled out of the lineage of the Levites. And someone of the ruling class said, I want you to be in charge of the religious elite, those that are in control of the temple and the people of Israel. So he took over in 6 AD. He served as the high priest until 15 AD, when the successor to Quirinius, Valerius Gratus, actually fired him. Let him go, and he brought somebody else in. In fact, Valerius appointed, I think it was 3 or 4 different high priests in a 3-year period. Like they couldn't figure it out. Couldn't figure out who it should be. Because you got to pick somebody who kind of looks holy but is loyal to you. Right? They don't necessarily have to be qualified to be, the high priest. I started thinking like political, anyway. But after all of this happened, there's 4 high priests that were appointed in the 3-year period. And then there was a high priest that was appointed. His name was Caiaphas. Joseph of Caiaphas, some call him. Caiaphas became the high priest in the year 18 AD. Now, what's interesting is the connection of Caiaphas to Annas. Annas. Let me say Annas. That's probably better way to say. My fault, guys. I knew I was going to do that. It's like, don't say Annas. Okay, my bad. All right, so here's the interesting part. You can see it on here. Caiaphas was the son-in-law to Annas. You guys had all looked at me funny when I said it, and you're just going to let me keep going. Just thanks. Oh, you guys were texting. Thanks. What's interesting, if you look at the lineage of this and the history, Annas became basically the godfather of the temple. Caiaphas was his son-in-law who took over as the high priest. And he actually served for a long time, from 18 AD to 36 AD, one of the longest high priests in that time period. Annas also had 5 other sons who eventually became high priests over the next few decades. In fact, I think they were the high priests of the Jewish temple for almost 60 years. So Caiaphas, son-in-law of Annas, golly, son-in-law of he wasn't chosen for his holiness, but his loyalty to Rome. And he is the high priest during Jesus' time, during the final week of Jesus. Y'all stop, come on, we got to move on. I got a lot more, we're almost done. So now imagine this, the temple is no longer just a spiritual center, it's a system run by a family appointed by the emperor or the empire, benefiting from control. every single dollar that came through the temple passed through the hands of Annas, even not as the high priest. When you'd come to pay a temple tax and do exchange, there was a additional percentage of interest added. Where did that go? To the priestly line. Portion of it would go up to Rome to keep Rome happy. But as long as we keep Rome happy, we get to keep our system working for us. And Jesus walks in and he disrupts this system. And once you see these names, especially the one that I keep mispronouncing, you can't unsee it. In John 11, you know the story? Jesus goes in, he raises Lazarus from the dead, right? Well, right after Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead, we see this, John 11:47. Then the chief priests and the Pharisees called a meeting of the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin is like the religious elite of the time. 71 men, they all come together in a room. They are the ones that run the temple, the system. They said this, "What are we accomplishing?" they asked. "Here is this man performing many signs. If we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him, and then the Romans will come and take away both our temple and our nation." Then one of them, named Caiaphas, who was the high priest that year, spoke up. "You know nothing at all. You do not even realize that it is better for you that one man die for the people than that the whole nation perish." He did not say this on his own, but as high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus would die for the Jewish nation. And not only for that nation, but also for the scattered children of God, to bring them together and make them one. Verse 53, so from that day on, they plotted to take his life. Caiaphas, the high priest, you see him here. This is right before Passover. Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead. They say, this guy's a problem. We need to kill him. It's better for one man to die than for the whole nation to perish. We don't want to lose our nation and our temple. We can't lose our power of religion and nationalism. This is not a theology, it was a strategy for them. Protect the system at all cost. And then later in the story, we know Jesus gets arrested, right? And I know we're jumping, but Jesus gets arrested. And do you know where they take Jesus right after they arrest him? So they arrest him in the Garden of Gethsemane, right? Remember this? Peter cuts off a guy's ear. Jesus is like, bro, chill out. Puts the ear back on. That's not what we do. He didn't say chill out. Sorry. That was my version. So this happens. They arrest him. The Roman authorities arrest Jesus. And they bring him to, John 18 says this, then the detachment of soldiers with its commander and the Jewish officials arrested Jesus. They bound him and brought him first to Annas, who was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, the high priest that year. Annas was not in any leadership position. But when you've got a plot to kill the man that is trying to take away your system, you take him to the Godfather first. So it goes to Annas. And since Caiaphas was the one who had advised the Jewish leaders that it would be good if one man died for the people, we saw that when he was talking about right after Lazarus. In fact, in this trial with Annas, a soldier slaps Jesus. It's the first physical abuse that happens to Jesus in this time heading to the cross. And for me, I envision like those movies that I've seen. The mob boss, you get brought to him, his goon smacks you. Like this is what is happening here. And it's actually lived, I talked about the houses that they found in archaeology and in history, from history. He lived in one of the largest houses in Jerusalem. It was opulent, gold everywhere. Like who does gold everywhere? Gross. They brought to Annas. He's still pulling the strings. He's still connected. Then they take him to Caiaphas. He's the high priest. And they take him to the Sanhedrin, the Jewish temple leadership. And then they send him to Pontius Pilate because temple leadership can't execute him. They need Rome to do that. And suddenly you see the whole structure pieced together. Religion, power, empire, all working together. And then there's a crowd, right? Pontius Pilate says, I find nothing wrong with this man, but I release one prisoner for Passover, so let's let the people decide. And they take him out, and here's Jesus, here's Barabbas. Who do you want me to release? Give Barabbas, right? Crucify Jesus. Now, these are not the same people that were at the gates with the palm branches shouting Hosanna. They would have been afraid to be even associated with Jesus. They would not have shown up to this trial. The people that would have shown up to this trial would have had connections. So who's yelling for Jesus to be crucified and give us back Barabbas? Connected to the system. So, let me ask you, do you see a thread playing out through the last week and life of Jesus? You see what got him killed? I didn't grow up hearing it this way. I think I grew up with a very flat reading of Scripture, where the story was simplified, it was individualized, it was detached from the idea of power. But I grew up as a young white man in the American South in Texas. And so most of the people around me and most of my leadership was all in that same vein. And so when we looked at this system or this story, what I had learned was I was formed in a system, and the text had been given to me like from the center of the story. So as I got older and started to study and learn and meet new people, I realized that I needed to see this from other perspectives. I needed to read this. And in this story, there are people that are being affected, so you need to read this from the perspective of the poor. You got to read it with the excluded. So I started to look and find theologians in the black theology camp, or liberation theology, or womanist theology. And if you know what womanist theology is, actually a theology built off of the life and place of black women. Because these traditions, ways of looking at the story, they ask different questions. Liberation theology would ask, like, how does this text sound to the oppressed? Black theology, through voices like James Cone, say you cannot understand the gospel apart from real suffering in history. Because maybe you're too far removed from that suffering, but I can show you what suffering looks like right here. Womanist theology, through voices like Dolores Williams, remind us to not glorify suffering, especially when the system is the one causing it. She says, I can't remember the exact phrase, but it's basically, we can remember the cross, but to glorify the cross is to glorify suffering at the hands of the system. When you read this through these lenses, you start to see what Jesus is doing from a different perspective. He's not protecting a system, he's protecting people. He's not here to protect the church, he's here to protect the people who are the church. And the part that gets uncomfortable is this isn't ancient history. When religion aligns with power, when theology protects systems, when leaders are defended at all cost, when people are harmed in the name of God, that is not new. And if we're honest, we see it. And we've seen it. We are seeing it right now. So if we go back to the temple, this is the last story. After all of this happens, Jesus has flipped tables, he's speaking in the temple, and this is one of the final stories he tells in the temple before he leaves that day. It says, as he taught, Jesus said, "Watch out for the teachers of the law. They like to walk around in flowing robes and be greeted with respect in the marketplaces and have the most important seats in the synagogues and the places of honor at banquets. They devour widows' houses and for a show make lengthy prayers. These men will be punished most severely. And then you continue in this story, and a widow walks into the temple. Jesus sat down opposite the place where the offerings were put, and he watched the crowd putting their money into the temple treasury. Many rich people threw in large amounts, but a poor widow came and put in 2 very small copper coins worth only a few cents. Calling his disciples to him, Jesus said, "Truly I tell you, this poor widow has put more into the treasury than all the others. They all gave out of their wealth, but she out of her poverty, but in everything, all she had to live on." Put in everything, all she had to live on. And for years, we've been told to admire that. Look at the generosity of this woman, giving everything she's got. She is so faithful. She's giving sacrificially to God. But that's not the point of the story. What if Jesus isn't celebrating what she just did, but he's exposing the system that is harming the widow who is giving all that she's got? A system that takes everything from someone who has nothing. Do you see the system at play? Do you see where Jesus is like, this is not my Father's house. This is not how this works. You are taking advantage of the people you are supposed to be protecting and loving. This poor widow comes in because she feels that she has to. In order to impress and please God, she must get all that she has. You are taking advantage of her. The system is broken and I must fix it. So we have to question underneath all of this, like, where does God stand in this system? And the answer over and over and over again is the same. God stands with the vulnerable. That love moves toward the marginalized. And Jesus protects his neighbor at all costs. Just before all this in the temple, Jesus teaches and he says that the greatest commands are to love God and to love your neighbor. And if love is real, then we see Jesus and we see that love always fights for neighbor. Not just gentle, but honestly. Not just kind, but courageously. Because sometimes love looks like healing, and sometimes love looks like truth, spoken to power, and breaking a system that is harming our neighbors. Sometimes love looks like turning over tables that should have never been standing in the first place. Jesus was shining a light on oppression, on exploitation, on harm of neighbor. He was showing how power and the gospel, they don't mix. Because power dehumanizes, creates hierarchies, and it corrupts the heart. Jesus was calling us back to the love of God, which always manifests itself as love of neighbor, especially the most vulnerable amongst us. So, this is our call from Jesus himself. To go love well, because that's who we're made to be, and that's what will break the system. I love you guys. We'll see you next week for Easter.